You're now listening to Boring History for Sleep. What was inside a typical peasant's pantry? A slow, soothing journey back to the muddy floors and smoky kitchens of medieval life where bread was hard, beans were plenty, and hope came in the shape of a turnip. Let your eyes grow heavy and your mind drift through the dusty shelves of the past. Hey guys, tonight we're going way back to a time when pantries didn't have sliding doors, mason jars, or that cute little chalkboard label that says organic quinoa. No, tonight, you're stepping into the stone-floored pantry of a medieval peasant. It smells like damp earth, sour grain, and a hint of desperation. The air is cool, but the vibe is warm in a rustic, I might starve kind of way. The door creaks as you enter. It's not really a room so much as a shaded nook off the main living space, if you can call a single smoky room with a sleeping loft and a hearth living space. Still, this pantry is the beating heart of survival, and you, lucky traveler, get to explore it, shelf by shelf. Well, if there were shelves, mostly, it's baskets, sacks, and piles. One wrong step, and you're in the flour. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge carefully across the hard-packed dirt floor. It's uneven, with the faint impression of old barefoot traffic smooth. In some places, deeply rutted, in others. Your boots kick up a whisper of dust as you approach the first pile of sacks, tied shut with frayed cords and stained with age. You loosen one, and out tumbles a modest cascade of barley. Not wheat, definitely not wheat. That stuff is for nobles, monks, or very lucky millers. Barley is the real MVP down here, the carbohydrate king of the medieval peasant's life. Barley gets ground into meal, boiled into porridge, and baked into bread so dark and dense it might legally qualify as a weapon. Your teeth would bounce off the crust, if not for the damp hearth air softening it a little. This isn't your bakery's crusty country loaf. This is survival bread. Nutritious, filling, and absolutely designed to outlast you in a siege. And, yes, it tastes functional. Sometimes the barley's mixed with rye or oats, if the harvest was kind, or with a sprinkling of weed seeds if it wasn't. And we don't mean cannabis, though medieval Europe did know what hemp was. We mean literal weeds. Because when the harvest fails, anything vaguely edible gets ground in. Historians still argue whether these bread extenders were chosen for their fiber, or just sheer necessity. Alongside the barley is a worn wooden box filled with coarse salt. Precious stuff. Salt isn't just a seasoning here. It's medicine, food preserver, even currency in some towns. This salt isn't pristine, white, it's grayish, clumpy, and might include a few unidentifiable specks. But it's invaluable, and no pantry would be caught without it. In the corner near the ground is a bundle of leeks already slightly wilted and muddy. Root vegetables often made their way into these dim storage areas, tucked into baskets stuffed with hay or cloth, to keep them cool and dry. Spoiler, it rarely worked. Your nostrils twitch. Something is turning, possibly the leek. Possibly the neighbor's goat sneezed near it. Possibly both. A small clay pot rests beside the leek. You crack open the wax seal, and ho, it's honey. Probably the only sweet thing in this entire pantry. A treasure, truly. Most peasants didn't get much. Sugar cane was exotic and expensive, so honey was the go-to when they needed a treat, medicine, or bribe for an especially stubborn child. It's not filtered or refined. Inside, it's cloudy, a little crystallized, and may or may not have a wing or two floating in it. But don't be ungrateful, it's sweet, and that's good enough for a winter night. Speaking of winter, you crouch by a shallow pit dug right into the earthen floor, lined with straw and covered with a wood plank. It's the makeshift cold storage. A few wrinkled apples are hiding in there, soft, bruised, but still edible. Barely. You pick one up, and your thumb sinks in just a little too far. Better. Stew it. The walls have hook-screwed nails, or pegs, really, and from one dangles a strip of what might have once been meat. It's hard to tell. It's been smoked within an inch of its life, hung here months ago, and likely rubbed with every preservative herb they could find. Still, it's a protein hit in a land where meat is a rare guest at the table. This one's a luxury and maybe a chewable fossil. You brush past a stack of wooden bowls and a single stone mortar, tucked away like someone tried to tidy up once and gave up. There's a small ball of old cheese, too hard as a knight's conscience. It's sharp, pungent, and absolutely indestructible. If you tossed it into the hearth, it might win the fight. What's that tucked in the corner behind a sack of oats? You lean in, and lo, a preserved loaf, shaped like a rounded brick and blackened from the fire. It's been there for weeks, maybe months, still edible-ish. These hard loaves are sometimes soaked in broth to make them palatable again, or used as trencher-seatable plates, or possibly thrown at bandits. And then, of course, there are rats. Oh yes. You hear the scritch-scratch of tiny claws behind one of the sacks. They're not guests, they're roommates. Every peasant knows the war between pantry and rodent is eternal. Cats help, sure, but only so much. You spot an overturned bowl in the corner and some gnawed grain. You sigh. This pantry isn't just feeding your family, it's feeding the ecosystem. So there you are, crouched in the dim pantry of a medieval home, surrounded by barley, salt, honey, and hope. You brush some dust off your sleeve and glance up at the low ceiling. This place isn't pretty. It isn't clean. But somehow, it's enough. It kept a family alive. And tonight, it keeps your imagination warm, too. You sit back on your heels, staring at the dim and musty pantry corner. The stone walls breathe cold, and the only light seeps in faintly from a smoke hole, or, if you're lucky, a tallow lamp hanging from a wooden peg. Your breath makes little clouds, and in this quiet stillness, your eye is drawn to the collection of jugs and clay vessels arranged as if this pantry were throwing a very small, very sad party. You reach out and lift a squat earthenware jug, its rim sticky and faintly as far as this dear sleeper is ale in style, brewed, thick, brown, and slightly chewy. And yes, I said chewy. This stuff isn't filtered or carbonated. It's liquid bread with a mood. It sloshes heavily in the jug, smelling of barley and yeast, and maybe just a whisper of yesterday's sweat. Water in medieval villages often came from dubious sources, so fermented drinks were safer bets. Everyone drank ale, men, women, and even children, though the kids' version was small beer, weak enough to hydrate without knocking little Timmy sideways into a dung pile. Brewing was a household chore, often handled by the woman of the house. You didn't need fancy equipment, just a pot, some grains, and a lot of faith. And maybe a wooden spoon you hope hasn't stirred anything to cursed recently. Beside the ale jug sits a narrower bottle, waxed shut and labeled. Not labeled. Let's be honest. Nobody here is printing bottle tags. But the smell when you pop the wax is unmistakable. Mead, honey wine, rich, golden, and probably the most luxurious thing in the pantry. Mead was for feasts, weddings, and bribing the reeve when your pig mysteriously vanished and showed up in your own stew. It was also prone to being experimental, depending on what herbs or berries got tossed in during the brew. Some of these concoctions might get you tipsy. Others might make you see a glowing monk in your rafters, whispering secrets. Historians still argue whether peasant brewing recipes were passed down with reverence or reinvented every time the last jug exploded. Behind the jars is a strange, crusty bottle, sealed with something that looks like dried mud, a fermented mystery. You hesitate, but curiosity wins. You uncap it and immediately regret it. The smell hits you like a disappointed landlord. This, my friend, is vinegar at least. Something heading there with speed. Originally intended as cider or ale, but neglected and transformed into sharp, mouth-wrenching sourness. It's a pantry tragedy. Or possibly a new ingredient. Because nothing goes to waste. Vinegar tenderizes tough meat, keeps flies off food, and occasionally serves as mouthwash. You're brave and/or immune to consequences. You wipe your hands on your tunic and squint at the shelf. One jug is different, trune-bellied, darker, heavier. You pull the cork and sniff, plum wine, or, judging by the sharpness, plum surprise. The village elder claims it was first brewed when he was a child. You're not sure he meant this exact jug, but the taste would suggest otherwise. Still, it's drinkable. If your standards are medieval and your courage high, you stand slowly, stretching as your knees pop like kindling. Your eyes adjust to the shadows, and there tucked beneath a folded cloth, you find a tiny flask. This one's not for daily use. It's carefully wrapped, protected. Inside is a clear spirit, probably distilled in secret. It's sharp, medicinal, and more flammable than polite conversation with a bishop. Some called it aqua vita, the water of life. Others called it trouble. In a peasant home, it might be used for illness, toothaches, or quietly shared on holy days to make the sermons go faster. Now, don't go imagining drunken revelry every night. Alcohol was nourishment as much as a pleasure. In the same way your pantry might include protein bars or meal shakes. There's had ale and meat, calories, carbs, and hydration in a sip. Of course, sometimes a sip turned into a snooze under the table, but that's just good medieval multitasking. You crouch again and run your fingers along the stone behind the jugs. Cold, always damp. A thin layer of mold is trying its best to thrive. The people here scrub it off with vinegar and sand, muttering small prayers as they do. Mold in your pantry isn't just gross, it's dangerous, but inevitable. And every villager develops a sixth sense for sniffing out danger from behind a cork. At the far end of the pantry sits a small wooden chest, once used for tools, now pressed into duty as a storage bin. Inside are dried herbs, some shriveled, fruit peels, and a jar of pickled something. Could be onions, could be eggs, could be a dare. The liquid is murky, and a thin layer of scum floats on top like it's guarding ancient secrets. You leave it be. Some mysteries are meant to sleep. You glance up and notice a leather wineskin hanging from a peg. Likely a traveler's item, used for long walks to nearby towns or fields. The contents are warm now, but back then, that didn't matter. Flavor came second. Preservation came first. A small sack beside it holds grains for brewing. Not flour, just dried malted barley and rye. It smells earthy and vaguely sweet, and it's a reminder that brewing was constant. You didn't just make ale once a year. You brewed, tasted, adjusted, panicked, started over. It was both art and survival. And finally, in the quietest, dustiest corner of the shelf, there's a cloth-wrapped bundle. You unfold it to find several dried herbs tied in bunches: wormwood, yarrow, mugwort. Some of these were used in brewing, before hops became widespread. Others had more personal uses. Mugwort, for instance, was believed to aid digestion, dreams, or repel evil spirits, depending on whom you asked, and how close they were standing to a church. As you lower the cloth, a gentle clink surprises you. Hidden beneath is a single clay cup, etched with an unsteady hand. A family keepsake, perhaps, or just the only cup that survived a decade of use. You place it carefully back on the shelf and step away. You pause, taking in the collection of liquids, and brews, each one a small testament to a family's resilience. There's no abundance here, no showy variety, but there is intention, tradition, and a quiet defiance against famine and monotony. Every jug tells a story. Some involve laughter, others involve running to the outhouse in great haste. But that, dear listener, is the pantry of a medieval peasant, a liquid library of survival. You're still crouched by the jugs, your knees beginning to consider an official complaint, when something catches your eye: a cracked clay bowl filled with dry pebble-sized things the color of old parchment. At first glance, you might think, they're stones or goat droppings. But no, these are the humble legumes, peas and beans, the unsung heroes of the medieval pantry. You scoop a handful and let them trickle through your fingers. Hard as gravel, but once soaked and stewed, they transform into the body and soul of many peasant meals. Broad beans, field peas, lentil steep, depending on where you are in Europe, these make up a large chunk of your caloric intake. Because meat is rare, and bread gets old, but beans keep showing up. Uninvited, unapologetic, and unfailingly. GASSY. Yes, you heard that right. Beans in the Middle Ages were the same social saboteurs they are now. Whole villages could probably be tracked by scent alone after a big pot of peas, but they were cheap, filling, and loaded with protein, which your body craves when the only other source of nourishment is a crust of yesterday's barley bread and hope. Peas. Pottage now. That's a dish to remember. Imagine a thick, greenish-brown stew, bubbling in a cauldron, flavored only by salt, garlic, if you're lucky, and occasionally a bone from something you ate 3 days ago. It's served hot, ladled into a shared wooden bowl, and eaten with a chunk of crust, or just slurped from a spoon, whittled from last year's firewood. Everyone eats it, and everyone suffers its musical consequences. You don't need medieval gossip when you can interpret the harmony of digestion. Historians still argue whether pottage recipes varied wildly from home to home, or if the standard slop was so universal it could pass for a village anthem. But beans weren't just food. Dried legumes were easy to store. In fact, many pantries hoarded them like treasure. Sacks of them lined against the wall, stacked carefully to keep dry. A little moisture, and they'd sprout prematurely. A lot of moisture, and they'd become a science experiment with legs. So peasants kept them bundled in linen, above the ground if possible, and prayed the roof held through spring. You peer into a second clay bowl. These are fava beans, thicker, flatter, earthier in smell. They were a staple in southern Europe, and increasingly seen in parts of the north. Some feared them, strangely enough. Ancient superstitions claimed that fava beans trapped souls. Roman priests once avoided them entirely. By the medieval era, most folks had moved past the idea of soul entrapment and focused more on what they could chew. Though if a bean sprouted into a tiny screaming ghost, we wouldn't be that surprised, would we? Next to the beans, tied in bunches and hanging from the low beams, are dried pods of peas. They're wrinkled, but not useless. In fact, peasants knew how to dry and store them for winter. Fresh peas were a spring treat, but dried peas were all your insurance. Soaking them overnight, boiling them for hours, and maybe even seasoning them with guessed it, salt, and a whisper of garlic. They could be turned into something resembling a meal, and just when you think the peasant pantry can't possibly contain another variation of things that boil for hours, you find the pulse mixture, bits of lentils, chickpeas, mystery seeds, possibly rogue grains that wandered into the wrong sack. These were mixed together and simmered down into thick stews that looked bleak but filled the belly. The thing is, meals weren't judged by Instagram-worthy presentation or exotic garnish. They were judged by whether you still felt hungry an hour later. Spoiler, with enough beans, you didn't. You felt full and gurgly. But full, your fingers touch a wooden spoon, stained deep brown, the edges worn from scraping countless pots. It's a humble tool, but essential. You imagine a mother stirring the family's single pot over the hearth, adding handfuls of peas, maybe tossing in the heel of a loaf to soak up broth. Children crouched nearby, hopeful, their noses twitching at the scent of warm food. The father comes in from the fields, muddy and tired, and for once, no one complains that it's beans again. because that's what legumes brought. Stability, predictability. One sack of peas could last weeks. Beans didn't spoil easily, and while their side effects were legendary, their reliability was sacred. You shift your weight and notice a small bowl of split peas, yellow, dull, and still clinging to bits of pod. These were often cooked into a paste, spread on bread, or turned into what might generously be called bean pancakes. Imagine a flapjack made of sadness and hope. But to a hungry peasant, it was better than nothing, and occasionally even enjoyable. At the very back of the pantry, tucked behind a lump of firewood and a ratty basket, you find a cloth pouch. Inside, lupin beans. Not common, and potentially toxic if not soaked for days, but some households knew how to tame them. A fringe legume, a rebellious cousin. Historians debate whether their presence indicates cultural influence from the Mediterranean, or just a curious forager with time and bravery to spare. And that's the charm of this pantry. It holds not only the expected but the eccentric. For every sack of barley, there's a pouch of maybe edible plant matter that someone swears cured their uncle's bad knee. For every bean, a whispered superstition. For every stew, a story. You rise, your knees groaning in protest, and glance once more at the legumes. Humble, yes. Flatulent, absolutely. But without them, most peasant households wouldn't have lasted a single harsh winter. Beans, in all their understated belly-bloating glory, were the bedrock of survival. So, the next time you dismiss a lentil stew or scoff at peas in your dinner, remember, for centuries, they weren't side dishes. They were lifelines. You shuffle further into the cool earthen pantry, where the scent shifts fainter now, tinged with something vaguely fishy, vaguely smoky, and definitely lingering. You pause near a stack of shallow wicker baskets covered with rough linen. You lift one cloth corner. Ah, the unmistakable bouquet of preserved fish. Welcome to the protein corner, or what passes for it when you're not a noble or a monk with access to fresh cuts and spice roots. For the medieval peasant, meat was a rarity, but fish was a seasonal godsend, especially if you lived anywhere near a river, lake, or coastline. And when it couldn't be eaten fresh, it was salted, dried, smoked, or all three. You lift a hardened slab from the top of the basket. It's stiff, almost fossil-like. Salt cod, or something that started life as cod before salt and time transformed it into medieval jerky. It's pale, crusted in white, and smells faintly of the sea. If the sea had been sitting in a sack for a while, this fish could last months, maybe years, if kept dry. Sure, you have to soak it for hours, beat it with a mallet, and stew it until it finally remembers how to be soft again. But hey, that's protein. Next to it is a more fragrant pile of smoked herring, strings of them looped over wooden rods like they're drying their tiny little ghost socks. The smell is strong, sharp, oily, deeply persistent. This is food that announces itself. It doesn't sneak quietly into your meal. It bursts through the door, slaps your taste buds, and tells you to sit down and be grateful. These fish aren't just for flavor, either. They're essential during Lent and other fasting days, when meat is off the table by church decree, which was, by the way, a lot of days. Some years, you're looking at 150 meatless days. So unless you were a vegetarian out of necessity, fish filled the gaps if you could get it. Historians still argue whether inland peasants truly had consistent access to preserved fish, or if it remained a luxury that trickled in sporadically, through trade or religious alms. In some households, salted eels were more common than cod. You pick one up and immediately regret it. Even dry, the eel feels moist, a contradiction wrapped in slime and regret. But they were hardy, abundant in rivers, and could be packed in barrels with layers of salt for long-term storage. Some households even smoked them on wooden racks, the oily scent clinging to the beams above. You glance to a lower shelf and find an old clay pot sealed with beeswax. You pry it open. Inside is a suspiciously dark, oily mass, fish paste, possibly anchovy, possibly an ancestor to garum or some proto-fermented spread designed to stretch protein across bread or porridge. This is the kind of flavor that lingers in your dreams. Whether that's good or bad depends on your dream tolerance. Not all meatless protein came from the river. There are also scraps of preserved porceus. Pork though, these are rare and jealously hoarded. A smoked knuckle, so dry it could stop an arrow. A sliver of bacon rind, nearly all fat, preserved more out of hope than practicality. These bits are usually chopped into stews to lend their smoky magic to a pot full of peas and turnips. You weren't eating a slice of ham, you were borrowing a whisper of it. You uncover a tiny cloth bundle and find dried sausages, rock hard and shriveled, like angry caterpillars. They're heavily salted, sometimes spiced if your garden yielded more than weeds. These were precious, often saved for special meals or visitors, or less glamorously kept in case someone in the household got sick and needed building foods. Because nothing builds strength like chewing a sausage for 20 minutes straight. A small wooden box nearby contains fish bones and brittle fin scraps saved for flavoring broth or thickening stew. Nothing was wasted. Even the leftover bones were tossed into the pot, simmered for hours, then fished out with a slotted spoon that probably doubled as a fly swatter. You spot a dried frog leg, possibly a joke, possibly dinner. It's unclear, and frankly, you're not asking. You stand, letting your fingers brush over the woven basket lids and the linen cloths stained with old grease. You imagine a family returning from market with one salted herring and dividing it, like treasure father gets the tail, mother the head, and the kids each get a fin and the smell. But, jokes aside, even these meager preserved offerings brought depth to the medieval diet. Smoked meat and fish weren't just for nutrition. They were reminders of community. Smoking racks were often shared. Curing barrels might be stored in communal spaces. People swapped techniques. How to use juniper wood for flavor, which spot in the loft stayed driest. What kind of clay pot best preserved that one slippery eel who refused to behave. And then there's the sheer art of preservation. Before refrigeration, this was your only defense against rot. Salt had to be bought or traded. Smoking required dry wood and timing. And drying meant praying the local animals didn't help themselves before you got back to check the rack. Preserving food was a gamble. Too much salt, and you couldn't chew it. Too little, and you'd meet regret face first in the outhouse. But every slab of smoked fish and twist of sausage hanging in a peasant pantry was a small victory over time itself. You breathe in the sharp, smoky air of the corner one last time. It stings a little, but there's comfort in it too. It's the scent of ingenuity, of stretching resources to their limits, of making do, of making it last. You pull the cloth gently back over the basket of salted cod and retreat, leaving the scent of the sea behind you, drifting like a memory into the shadows of the pantry. You move on from the smoky corner, blinking the fishy temps from your eyes, only to be greeted by a new smell, earthy, musty, and faintly kabuji. You found the root cellar portion of the pantry, where vegetables go to nap for the winter, wrapped in straw, tucked into baskets, and hopefully not forgotten until they sprout. Eyes and plot against you. You lift the edge of a straw-stuffed bin and find a pile of turnips. They're knobby, misshapen, and aggressively beige, with streaks of purple where the sun once kissed their tops. Not the glamorous kind of vegetable you see in a gourmet stew photo. These are medieval turnips, shrugged, unimpressed, and the culinary equivalent of a shoulder shrug. Still, they're reliable. You can boil them, mash them, roast them on a good day, and pretend they're potatoes centuries before potatoes even show up to the party. Next to them, half buried in hay, are cabbages. Their outer leaves are limp and rubbery, flecked with old dirt and maybe a few bold slug tracks. But peel those layers back, and you'll find the crisp heart still intact, ready to be chopped into stews, fried over a hearth, or eaten raw in desperation. Cabbage was a winter hero. It lasted, it fought back, and in large enough quantities. It made sure the whole house knew it was there. You nudge a woven basket with your boot and discover a collection of carrots. Not the slender, bright orange kind you buy today, but stubby, crooked things in yellow and purple. Orange carrots wouldn't become dominant until centuries later. These medieval variants have a more herbal, bitter bite and likely still have a bit of soil clinging to them, just enough for that authentic farm-to-mouth experience. Historians still argue whether these root vegetables were grown primarily for food or as animal fodder that peasants just learned to tolerate. Either way, they found their way into every pot by necessity, if not enthusiasm. You spot a small wooden tub of parsnip spell and sweet-smelling when fresh, though these are half-wrinkled and look like they've seen things. Parsnips were often used when other roots failed or tasted like punishment. Some families even baked them into simple cakes with leftover flour and drizzles of honey. Dessert, maybe, or at least a break from beans. In the far corner, nearly forgotten, a hanging bundle of dried garlic sways gently in a draught. Garlic is a pantry staple flavor, medicine, ward against evil, all rolled into one. In some households, it was rubbed around windows to keep spirits out. In others, it went straight into the stew, fighting both illness and blandness with equal intensity. The line between superstition and seasoning was thin, and sometimes you weren't entirely sure which one you were biting into. You move aside another cloth and uncover a pile of onions, their papery skins fluttering with your breath. These are the multitaskers of the pantry, cooked down into soups, stuffed into pies, if you're lucky enough to own a pie, and strung up in braids to dry for the winter. A spoiled onion smells like betrayal. A fresh one brings a stew to life. And speaking of betrayal, you uncover a few wrinkled apples nestled in straw. They've lasted surprisingly well, but their skin is soft and bruised, and one of them has a suspicious hole that might just wink at you if you look too long. Apples were harvested in fall and stored carefully, each one wrapped in cloth or straw to avoid contact. One bad apple could ruin the bunch wasn't just a saying, it was a lived fear. If you had a dozen, you checked them daily like nervous parents with sleeping infants. Lurking beneath the apples, in a cool, damp nook, are leeks. Their green tops are limp, but the white bulbs are still firm. Leeks were a peasant favorite. Easy to grow, easy to stew, and strong enough to overpower the taste of whatever else was hiding in your pot. Toss in a leek, and suddenly that scrap of rat meat becomes rat allium. Along one beam above your head, you notice herbs drying in small bundles: sage, parsley, maybe some marjoram or thyme. These herbs were hung in late summer to dry, and used sparingly all winter. They added flavor, but also lent a sense of care, of ritual, of turning something bland into something beloved. You crush a bit between your fingers, and the scent fills your nose, sharp, clean, green. It feels, for just a moment, like spring. In the farthest corner of this vegetable menagerie is a shallow pit dug right into the floor, where cabbages and beets lie side by side. The beets are a deep, muddy, purple, thick-skinned, and hard as rocks. But stew them long enough, and they give up their sweetness reluctantly, like a cranky uncle who finally cracks a smile. Near the pit is a wooden cask. You pry the lid off, expecting disappointment, but what greets you is sauerkraut, fermented cabbage, tangy and sour and still faintly fizzy. Fermentation was the medieval miracle preservation through bacteria and hope. The kraut's sharp scent slices through the pantry's gloom, and your stomach, out of habit, grumbles in response. The kraut is cloudy, flecked with caraway, floating in its own brine, like cabbage ghosts, swirling in a pickled seance. It's a culinary marvel, and it'll keep you from scurvy if you're lucky enough to eat it semi-regularly. It's also a community dish. Whole villages, sometimes fermented together in shared crocks, passing down flavor like a family heirloom. You ease the lid back on, careful not to splash yourself. Sauerkraut stains aren't noble, and here you are, surrounded by roots and leaves, by the humble harvest of honest earth. These aren't glamorous ingredients. They won't win bake-offs or medieval Iron Chef, but they fed families, survived winters, and turned bleak nights into warm meals. You step back and take it all in. Dirt still clings to some of the vegetables. A cabbage leaf flutters to the floor. Somewhere, a mouse squeaks and scurries away. This is pantry life, messy, imperfect, and utterly alive. You brush your hands together, flecks of hay and dirt falling to the floor, and turn to a modest wooden shelf near the pantry wall. On it sit several small bundles wrapped in cloth, waxed leather, and surprisingly a bit of old parchment. These aren't roots or grains. These are dairy relics. Welcome to the cheese zone. Now, let's manage expectations. You're not staring at golden wheels of Gouda stacked like treasure. You're squinting at rough lumps of aged curd in a variety of colors from beige to probably fine. Cheese, in the medieval peasant world, was not the elegant charcuterie board centerpiece it is today. It was dense, funky, and often aggressive. You unwrap a cloth bundle and are greeted by a whiff that could politely be described as mature. This is hard cheese, really hard. As in, you might need an axe. It's been aging for weeks, maybe months, dried out in the loft or by the hearth, and then stored here where it's cool and dryish. No one's checking humidity levels, just hoping it doesn't walk away on its own. This kind of cheese is cut into slivers and shaved into gruel or stew. Rarely eaten alone, unless you're desperate or fond of chewing leather. It's sharp, salty, and if you squint, almost nutty. It gets the job done, adds protein, and doesn't spoil easily. Beside it lies a much softer lump, wrapped in broad dock leaves and slightly weeping. You touch it, cautiously. Fresh cheese curds, really. Soft, spreadable, a few days old. This was likely made from yesterday's milk, boiled and curdled with rennet from a calf's stomach, or an old vinegar trick. It's mild, crumbly, and still smells faintly of the goat it came from. But to a peasant, this was luxury. Spread on crusty bread, that's dinner with flair. There's even a little pot of what might be clotted cream or a failed butter attempt. You give it a stir. It's gritty, slightly sour, but usable. This was churned by hand, sometimes by the oldest child in the family using a wooden plunger in a tall churn until it's separated. It's labor-intensive, loud, and often ends with sore arms and a splash to the face. Historians still argue whether peasants had regular access to butter, or if it was considered a market good, sold to townsfolk while the family scraped by on thin milk and faith. In some regions, butter was more common, especially where cows thrived. In others, oil or lard was the fat of choice, if you could find it. You spot a few small skin flasks hanging from pegs. Inside buttermilk, thin, tangy, and oddly refreshing. After the butter's removed, this liquid remains. It's used in porridge, soups, or even drunk straight if your stomach can handle it. Some swore it cured ailments. Others swore it caused them. Either way, it was too valuable to waste. Below the shelf, in a lidded bucket, you find the holy grail, actual milk. Well, today's milk, still warm, slightly foamy, and probably goat-sourced. Cow milk was available, but less common in some regions. Goats were the scrappy MVPs, easier to feed, house, and milk. But goat milk, it has a personality, and sometimes it bites back. Most peasants didn't store milk for long. It went off within a day without cooling, so it was quickly turned into something else: cheese, curds, or broth. Some used it in baking, or if they had a sick relative, fed it to them with herbs mixed in. Milk was food, medicine, and offering. And speaking of offering, You glance into a tiny ceramic bowl pushed to the back of the shelf. Inside is a crumbly white substance, probably dried Whey cheese, also called white cheese in some records. This was the final product of boiling down the liquid left after curds were removed. It wasn't glamorous, but it was edible, and in winter, that was enough. In some corners of Europe, households even flavored this kind of cheese with herbs or ash, depending on tradition. Ash, because sometimes the only thing available to season your cheese was the remains of the fire you cooked it over. You pick up a small wooden spoon, coated in dried residue, and imagine someone gently stirring curds in a pot, watching them separate, knowing the cheese might keep their child alive through frost. The process wasn't just culinary, it was ritual. It was survival. You glance to a second, slightly warmer shelf. This one has a few unappetizing surprises. Spoiled milk, covered with a thin mold crust. You don't touch it, but it reminds you failure was part of the rhythm. Not every batch worked, not every curd set. But peasants tried, over and over, because giving up meant hunger. There's even a cup of milk wine sitting nearby, fermented milk, probably goat, possibly a disaster, sometimes called kumis in the steppes or other regions. Fermented milk found its way into European corners, too, though it was rarer. Whether it was an acquired taste or a last resort, well, that's between you and your gag reflex. Tucked behind the spoiling milk is a small slab of something chalky white, lard, rendered fat from a pig, saved in earthen pots or animal stomachs, and used to cook everything from bread to beans. It's not technically dairy, but it lives in the same realm, medible, spreadable, a little suspect, and completely essential. You lean back and take in the shelf. Cheese, curds, milk, maybe butter, probably lard. It's not a feast, but it's nourishment. 1,000 years ago, these dairy products were the glue of the peasant pantry, binding meals together, adding fat where famine lurked, and giving flavor to a bowl of otherwise depressing barley mush. In the flickering light, the cheeses glistened slightly, their rough textures catching the glow like tiny moons in a galaxy of clay and wood. You imagine the hands that shaped them, tired, practiced, grateful, and you realize that dairy wasn't just sustenance, it was daily magic. You leave the curdled sanctuary of the cheese shelf behind and turn your gaze to a peculiar set of containers, tucked into the driest, best-guarded corner of the pantry. This is not the place for loose turnips or bubbling milk experiments. No, this is the treasure shelf, and its contents. Spices. Sort of. Don't get too excited. We're not talking cinnamon sticks tied with velvet, or piles of saffron cradled in golden bowls. This is a peasant's pantry, which means what lies here might be spices, or just very confident dirt. You peer into a small stoppered jar. Inside is a dark, fine powder pepper, perhaps, or ground dried root. You give it a sniff. Sharp, bitter, familiar-ish. It might be black pepper, diluted with toasted breadcrumbs to stretch it out. Or it might be a local seed, pulverized into a pepper-like imposter. In the Middle Ages, especially for peasants, spice authenticity was a gamble, and that's where the charm begins. True spices, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, had to come a very, very long way. From India, from the Spice Islands, from worlds so far-flung most villagers thought they were just monk bedtime stories. And because of that distance, these spices were astronomically expensive. Like sell your sheep expensive. Like use it once a year, and talk about it the rest of your life, expensive. So when a peasant had something called spice, it was often a substitute, or a watered-down version. Grains of paradise, long pepper, mustard seed, and local roots stood in for the real deal. Some clever souls even ground burnt bread or dried bark to fake spice color and texture without the cost. Historians still argue whether spice adulteration was a form of fraud, resourcefulness, or both. Let's be honest, was probably both. When you can't afford saffron, Marigold petals look awfully promising. You open another pouch. Inside, a light brown powder with a sweet smell could be cinnamon, or cassia, or, less flatteringly, ground sweet wood scraped from a hedge and passed down as foreign delight. It's hard to know. Medieval labeling laws were non-existent, and no one was leaving Yelp reviews about the oregano. Still, when used sparingly, these mystery spices elevated food from bleak to interesting. A pinch in a pot of beans, a sprinkle over stew, enough to confuse the palate and convince the stomach. It's having a party. Next to the pouch is a single dried clove. One, not a bag, not a cluster, just one. Possibly saved for a holiday or a toothache. Cloves were known for their numbing quality and were occasionally pressed into aching gums or worn in a pouch to ward off plague, because if you're going to die, you might as well smell nice. You spot another jar, sealed with wax and marked with a charcoal smear. Inside, salt. This one is cleaner than the sack you saw earlier, finer, almost white, reserved for special dishes or guests, perhaps. Salt was critical for food preservation, yes, but also a symbol of worth. The phrase "worth your salt" wasn't just clever, it was economic truth. You move to a folded cloth satchel and find dried herbs, local ones this time. Sage, rosemary, thyme, maybe some dried wild garlic. These weren't technically spices, but they did the heavy lifting in most kitchens, and while they lacked the mystique of imported seasonings, they were fresher, easier to replace, and didn't cost a sheep's ransom. Tucked behind the herbs is a tiny wooden box. You open it gently. Inside are what look like really nutshells. Empty, save one shriveled nutmeg bead. You shake it. It rattles like a holy relic. Nutmeg was very rare for peasants, usually traded in flecks or gifted by generous lords. This little bead might have flavored a dozen meals already, and still been dried, back out and reshelved like magic. You imagine a feast night, some village festival, where someone brings out a pinch of real cinnamon, and everyone swoons. The pot bubbles, the air sweetens, and for a brief moment, life feels almost extravagant. Then you spot a strange black chunk wrapped in waxed cloth. You unwrap it slowly, and the smell punches you. Sharp, smoky, strange. It's dried asafetidal, so known as devil's dung. It stinks like garlic and onions had an argument in a swamp. But used sparingly, it flavors food deeply. Some European kitchens experimented with it when allium stocks ran low. It was medicine too, or punishment, depending on preparation. You close it back up quickly, preserving both the spice and your remaining appetite. One more jar sits alone, a narrow ceramic container sealed with beeswax. You crack it open. Inside, dried ginger root, curled and hard as bone. Imported ginger was valued, not just for its flavor, but also its warmth. It was considered hot in the medieval medicinal system, something that balanced cold, wet bodies, and warded off disease. It also masked the smell of meat that was past its prime. The ginger's origin was a world away, but somehow, a chunk found its way into this modest pantry. Maybe a traveling merchant passed through. Maybe it was payment for work. Maybe it was stolen. Regardless, it's here, and it's been shaved down carefully, clearly used with reverence. You let the wax lid fall back into place and look around. This quiet corner, this is more than food. It's alchemy. It's hope in a jar, mystery in a pouch, luxury in a pantry of scarcity. Peasants didn't have much, but they dreamed big. A single exotic spice might be talked about for months. Recipes were shared in whispers. Flavor stories passed down like fairy tales. You step back from the spice shelf, leaving its aromas to mingle gently in the shadows. The air feels warmer here, touched by far-off lands and distant hopes. And you can't help but smile, because even in the hardest times, people still found a way to add a pinch of wonder. You wander further into the dim pantry, brushing past the spice-scented air, like walking out of a fleeting dream. and find yourself staring at a rickety wooden coop door wedged into the side of the stone wall. It's not really a door, more of a flap, patched with cloth and hope. But behind it, the heartbeat of the medieval peasant's protein supply, the henhouse hustle. You ease the flap open and peek inside. The scent is earthy hay, feathers, and the unmistakable whiff of ammonia. It's not offensive exactly, just assertive. Inside the little enclosure are 2 hens nestled in straw and one extremely judgmental rooster watching you like he owns the deed to the place. And in a way, he does. You spot them eggs, several of them, warm and fragile, nestled into the hay, like little treasures. For peasants, eggs weren't just breakfast, they were currency, insurance, and sometimes the difference between feast and famine. You gently pick one up. It's small, with a pale brown shell and tiny speckles. Nothing like the oversized supermarket eggs we take for granted. These eggs were laid whenever the hens felt like cooperating, which without artificial lighting and regulated diet, less frequent in winter. Sometimes a hen would go broody and refuse to lay. Sometimes a fox helped itself to the entire coop. You never quite knew what the next morning would bring. Still, on a good week, a household might gather half a dozen eggs, boiled, fried over the hearth, baked into a dense oat cake, or just eaten raw in dire times. Every use was calculated. Eggs weren't wasted. Even the shells were crushed and scattered in the garden, or fed back to the chickens as calcium. Historians still argue whether most peasants kept chickens strictly for eggs, or if meat was a regular fallback. Likely, it varied by region and how desperate things got. A hen past her laying prime might become stew. But that was a decision made with serious thought and, probably, a family council. You look back at the rooster, still glaring. He's not just there for noise. Roosters protect the flock, fertilize eggs if you're raising chicks, and occasionally end up as the centerpiece of a Sunday pottage. Tough, stringy, but flavorful if you boil him for several hours and throw in half the herb garden in a small wooden box nearby. You find cracked shells, some whole, others shattered. Maybe from a misstep, maybe from young hands collecting too quickly. The broken ones get fed to pigs or tossed onto the compost pile. Nothing is wasted. Even failure has a purpose. You glance up at a wooden beam above the hen coop. Tied to it is a hanging cage, a sort of medieval mini-fridge. Inside is a piece of poultry, already plucked, drying in the air. The feathers are gone, the skin pulled tight, the meat a little gray, not fresh, but not spoiled. This bird was likely culled in the past day or two and left to age slightly tenderized by time and cool air, or so the theory goes. Chicken wasn't eaten regularly. It was a special meal, perhaps a festival dish, or a sick person's treat. If you killed a bird, you made the most of it. Every part was used, the feet for gelatinous soup, the liver in a thick barley stew, even the neck and skin boiled for broth. Beside the hanging carcass is a shallow clay dish with a few spotted quail, eggs tiny, delicate, and rare. Maybe the household kept other fowl, or maybe these were traded or gifted. Regardless, they're precious, and likely destined for baking, bribery, or a once-in-a-decade omelet. You nudge open a rough wooden crate and discover a pile of feathers, cleaned, sorted, some tied together with string. These weren't food, but they mattered. Stuffed into bedding, tied onto arrows, even used in hats when peasants got fancy. A well-kept hen gave more than just eggs. You pause, listening to the soft clucks and shuffles from the little coop. There's something warm, here alive, self-renewing, hopeful. Chickens were the only livestock many peasants could afford. They didn't take up much space, fed on scraps, and offered a continuous cycle of giving if protected from illness, thieves, and predators. You remember a tale told in hushed tones by the hearth of a chicken that laid 3 eggs one morning, 3, and the entire family swore it was a sign from the saints. The youngest child got the first yolk, the father the second. and the third was boiled and offered to the Virgin Mary's statue in the village chapel. People found miracles in eggs. You turn to the side of the coop, where a small basket sits, under a cloth. You lift it carefully, inside, to duck eggs. Larger, glossier, a little odd. Duck eggs were stronger in flavor and rarer for landlocked peasants, but they happened. Ducks were harder to manage, messier, more demanding, but their eggs were prized for baking, if not for diplomacy with the rooster. Just as you're about to lower the cloth, you spot something buried at the bottom. A broken egg, half-formed chick. Inside, it's a sharp, silent moment, a reminder that food came from life, and not all of it was pretty. This one didn't make it, but even that had a use, fed to pigs, perhaps, or buried in the garden as fertilizer. Even tiny tragedies had their place in the cycle. You stand, brushing straw from your knees, and catch your reflection in a small copper pot of water nearby. Your face looks out of place, here clean, modern, wide-eyed at the humble miracle of eggs and feathers. And maybe that's what lingers most in this corner of the pantry. Life. The hum, cluck, and flutter of a coop within arm's reach of your bread and butter. A tiny, feathery engine of survival, scratching out its days, laying little oval promises in the hay. You leave the coop behind, with a final nod to the rooster, who still hasn't blinked, and wander into a quieter, darker alcove of the pantry. The air is cooler here, more fragrant, filled with dry, papery rustles and the sharp temps of plants that once grew wild and defiant in the fields just beyond the village. This is the herb and hedge corner. Not quite food, not quite medicine, and in some cases, not quite legal. You approach a line of dried bundles hanging from the low beams above. Their long, brittle stems are tied with string, and some have lost their leaves to time and gravity, leaving little green piles scattered beneath them. You reach up and pinch a sprig sage. Dusty, familiar, a little leathery in texture. Sage was used for seasoning meat when meat existed, or thrown into boiling water as a kind of digestive cure. Some even placed it beneath pillows to ward off bad dreams. Next to it hangs a tangle of rosemary, stiff and spiky. In cooking, it masked the flavor of older meat. In medicine, it was boiled into a tea for headaches. In folklore, it guarded against evil spirits and memory loss. Peasants might not know the chemistry, but they knew what helped after a bad stew and a worse winter. You crush a dried leaf between your fingers and inhale. Sharp, floral, grounding. In a world full of mud and hardship, this was perfume and potion, all in one. But not everything in this section is so tame. You lift a bundle that looks more chaotically as misshapen, stem-twisted mugwort. Now we're stepping into the realm of dreams and ghosts. Mugwort was used in teas, burnt as incense, and tucked into shoes for long journeys. It was said to promote vivid dreams, or keep evil away from the bed. Some even believed it could help predict the future, though what kind of future? No one ever said. Historians still argue whether herbs like mugwort and yarrow were truly medicinal, or simply placebo wrapped in centuries of whispered magic. Either way, when you're sick and desperate, belief can taste better than reason. You turn to a small wooden shelf, stacked with clay pots, each one labeled with a crude mark, scratched in with a hot nail. You lift a lid and find a smear of green paste, comfrey, and tallow, a healing salve, applied to bruises, sprains, even broken bones, in hopeful cases. Another pot holds something yellower, stickier, a honey and calendula mix, used to treat cuts. Honey was both antiseptic and sweet, ideal for medicine you might otherwise spit out. And then there's the dried nettle. You eye it warily, touching it raw would sting, even in death. But brewed into a tea, it was said to help with joint pain, childbirth, and an entire list of ailments, scribbled down in some friar's itchy parchment notes. You brush your hand over a few glass vials nestled in straw. One contains a dark red powder, possibly powdered beetroot or elderberry, used to boost the blood. Another holds pale flecks that shimmer faintly, dried chamomile, the medieval answer to melatonin. Peasants steeped it before bed, drank it for stomach aches, and occasionally just sniffed it to calm their nerves before facing another mud-clogged morning. And then, tucked behind everything, you find a black velvet pouch tied shut with twine. It feels out of place. You untie it slowly, and inside are 3 dried mushrooms, brown, crusty, and a little too quiet. You've found the pantry's fringe. These could be anything: medicinal mushrooms, hallucinogenic ones, the kind a local healer uses when prayer and garlic fail. In some villages, mushrooms were boiled into broths that supposedly opened the eye of the soul. In others, they were strictly avoided. Too dangerous, too mysterious, too effective. You gently close the pouch. You've seen enough YouTube videos to know not to eat unidentified fungus in an unfamiliar pantry. Nearby sits a bottle of infused olive oil. If someone had a trade connection, or maybe a mix of rendered animal fat and crushed herbs, used for salves, massages, even candle fuel. The line between food and medicine was thin, even thinner between medicine and myth. And then there are the weeds, yes, actual weeds: chickweed, dandelion, plantain. The stuff modern people pull from garden beds was, to a peasant, dinner and medicine both. Dandelion leaves made decent salad. Greens in spring. Plantain leaves were pressed to bug bites. Chickweed, good in soup and said to help with fevers. You start to realize that what we call a lawn nuisance was, back then, Tuesday's supper. 1 small bowl holds crushed charcoal and ground up fennel. You raise an eyebrow. This was toothpaste, or something close to it. Rubbed onto the teeth with a twig or rag, it kept breath manageable and mouth infections at bay. Maybe. A final pouch contains dried lavender and sage rolled together, likely a smudge bundle, used to cleanse a space of illness or sorrow, or perhaps just to cover the smell of your brother's feet. And here, in the lowest drawer of the herb shelf, wrapped in waxed paper and tied with a twist of blue string, is the emergency reserve. Poppy seeds. Used sparingly, very sparingly. Ground and steeped, they produced a sleepy drink for the very ill, the very old, or the very loud child whose parents needed a break. Dangerous in the wrong doses, comforting in the right ones. You sit back on your heels, overwhelmed not by the size of the collection, but its depth. This is a pharmacopoeia of survival, a witch's larder, a grandmother's drawer of secrets. Some of it works, some of it's belief wrapped in leaf and twine, but all of it is care. Someone picked these, dried them, remembered them, for pain, for healing, for nights too long and days too heavy. You inhale the mixed, scent-sweet chamomile, bitter wormwood, dusty sage, and feel the room thicken with time. This is no longer just a pantry, it's a memory garden. You rise from the herb nook slowly, brushing your hands off against your tunic, and step into the final space of this quiet, chaotic little pantry. It's the most worn-down corner, hidden in shadow, with sagging shelves and baskets that seem held together more by willpower than structure. Here lies the last resort shelf, the emergency stash, the hunger time cache, the pantry equivalent of the glove box full of expired mints and stress granola bars. You kneel beside a crooked wooden crate and peel back its covering. Inside are a few crusts of bread, old, dark, cracked. You tap one, it knocks back. This isn't food, this is a culinary fossil. But to a medieval peasant, even this had value. Soaked in broth, rubbed with garlic, or dropped into a pot, it softened, just enough to chew. Barely. Next to it is a heap of mystery flour, part barley, part rye, maybe part sawdust on a bad harvest. It's coarse, darker than you expect, and smells faintly of damp earth and effort. This flour was the final stretch before famine. Bread made from it would fill the stomach, but not the heart. You'd chew it with patience and swallow with resolve. You find a small cloth pouch inside, a dusty mix of dried peas, cracked oats, and ground acorn meal. Yes, acorns. When grain ran low, people turned to the trees. Acorns had to be soaked and boiled multiple times to leach out their bitterness and toxins. But with time and desperation, even squirrels' food became human supper. Historians still argue whether acorn flour was a common peasant fallback or a signal that things had gotten truly dire. Either way, if you're baking with it, the weather and your luck have turned against you. You open a lidded jar and find dried nettle greens, crushed and brittle. These would have been tossed into boiling water to create a green broth, thickened with flour or a pinch of fat. Nettle soup wasn't delicious. It was necessary. Tucked beside it is something more sobering, a knotted bundle of thin, flat bark strips, birch or elm, sometimes boiled to extract a sort of gelatinous broth when everything else was gone. It wasn't nourishing, it just fooled your stomach into thinking you were eating. You reach under the shelf and find a large iron pot, blackened and chipped, likely dragged to every family hearth since someone first bought it. This was the communal cauldron, the keeper of the everyone's welcome stew. During famine, families combined scraps, roots, stale bread, and whatever could be scrounged, one turnip, a spoon of oats, a pinch of salt, and made a dish not meant to impress, but to include. This was the pot, the kind where a mouse might fall in one night, and you'd still eat it the next day, because the broth was hot, and hope was rarer than flavor. You imagine a cold spring evening, the fields muddy, the sky gray, and families gathering around the fire with chipped bowls. The pot is stirred slowly, steam curling like a prayer into the rafters. Children chew in silence. The old ones nod solemnly. No one complains, because even that bland, foraged stew means survival. Near the hearthside shelf, a wooden bowl rests containing wild roots, likely dug from the edges of fields, sorrel, burdock, maybe even cattail bulbs. Not traditional crops, but edible, just. These would have been used in starving season, the dreaded gap between late winter and early spring, when old stores had run out and the new crops had yet to grow. You run your hand across a worn beam. There are notches carved into it, tallies, perhaps of stored items, or hunger days, or lives, a quiet accounting only the family understood. Next to it, you find a tiny sack filled with crushed eggshells and ash. This was used to clean cookware, sometimes even added to dough, to stretch it with minerals. In other cases, it served in folk rituals spread at the door to ward off illness or misfortune. What could not be eaten still had purpose. At the very edge of this corner, an empty jar sits, nothing inside, but the way it's placed carefully, reverently tells you at once. Held something important, perhaps lard, perhaps honey, perhaps just memory, because here, in the dust of the forgotten shelf, you feel the ache of survival. The silence between meals, the slow reckoning of a hard year, and yet, woven through the scarcity, is a thread of generosity. The village widow, who gave her only onion, the child who split their egg, the old man who stirred the pot and handed you the bigger piece. This was where peasants proved their resilience, not in feasts or bounty, but in empty bowls shared with full hearts. And now, the pantry quiets, the fire's gone low, the hens have tucked themselves in, the last rat has scurried past without ceremony, and above you, the heavy timbers creak, stretching like old bones, settling into sleep. You look around one final time. Baskets of dried beans, sacks of barley, crusts of black bread. The scent of garlic and rosemary still lingers faintly in the air. There's a whisper of fish smoke, the gentle must of straw, the sharp bite of old vinegar clings to the stone. Everything here has a purpose, even the things that no longer feed. You once did. Every crust saved, Every herb bundled, every egg nestled in straw was a small act of care, one that helped a family make it to another morning. Outside, the wind brushes softly against the thatched roof. Somewhere a baby fusses, and a dog gives a single, tired bark. But inside this pantry, inside this story, the world is still, as though it, too, is pausing for sleep. So let your shoulders relax, let your breath grow slow and steady. Picture that simple clay bowl, cradled in your hands, steam curling gently above it, carrying warmth into your chest. Because tonight, you've walked through centuries, and now you can rest.